Welcome to our S.O.A.P video. We are starting the last part of the book of Isaiah. Right? This time we'll be reading in selections in chapters 40 through 66 over the next 6 weeks. And so what we're going to do tonight is sort of do a little bit of a background on the book of Isaiah, because we're skipping 39 chapters.
Yeah, so that is the question, right?
Why are we doing that?
What's important? What's happening in there? Or why aren't we doing that?
Talk to us about Isaiah and the first 39 chapters, and then I'll pick up with chapter 40.
Yep, exactly. So Isaiah is a major prophet, probably the majorist prophet, whatever you want to call it. But he started being a prophet about 740 years before Jesus. And I'll do my best not to throw out a lot of dates, and they're not going to be on the test either. But so Israel during this time had a number of kings. And the kings were responsible for, leading the kingdom. And then they also had these prophets. And there was more than one at any given time. And the prophets were responsible for receiving the word from God and then telling the king and the people what God said. So that had to be a fun job. But
especially with some of those kings.
Yeah, but let's talk about the kings for a minute. Yeah, so the kings, as you can imagine, there was good and bad kings. And it was kind of a circle that was happening, where there would be a good king would come in, and all the people, or the nation of Israel, would get tight with God again, and things would be great, yay! And then something would happen. And then a bad king would take over, and everybody would fall away from God, and God would basically do something drastic to get their attention again. And we had this circle and circle, but it wasn't just a circle, it was also a downward spiral that was happening. So the nation as a whole was getting worse and worse,
much like Judges,
right?
Much like the time of the Judges.
Well, in fact, this Isaiah's story is also in 1st and 2nd Kings, primarily in 2nd Kings, his part, but where they go through every king and give more of a background than Isaiah. But you can kind of match those two together. Yeah. So like I said, prophets had really an impossible job. When you first think about it, it's like, how hard is it? I make a prophecy 1,000 years in advance. It's going to rain on Wednesday, and you're done, and yay, you get to go home. But that's not the case. They understood that wasn't the job. So not only did they have to deliver these messages, generally the messages they were delivering were not well received. Yeah. So a lot of these guys were killed. Were murdered either by the king or even by the nation, the population of the nation, that weren't happy with what they had to say.
God usually didn't send prophets when things were going well. The priests were there, they were doing their job. The prophets were to bring the people back to God, which means they were already on the other side.
Right, so anybody could show up and say, God told me to tell you this. Right. All right, are you a prophet? So they seem to come up with the concept of short-term and long-term prophecies, where I just can't say 1,000 years from now. I have to say, not tomorrow, but in some time in the not too distant future, here's what's going to happen. Yep. And then if that prophecy came true, give more credence to, hey, maybe this guy is with God, and maybe we should listen to him.
Yeah, you can believe the far prophecy if the near one happens.
If the near one happens. Yep.
And God did that intentionally, so that obviously they could trust His prophets. Right.
So at the time of Isaiah, the nation of Israel had been broken into two sections. There was a kingdom of Israel in the north. I always got to look up the notes there. And then the kingdom of Judah in the bottom. Yep. And Judah was Judah and Benjamin. And then the rest of the clan, was above. And things happened politically, so they finally divided into two sections, into a north and south. And then from Isaiah's point of view, about 20 years after he became a prophet, Assyria, who was kind of the regional powerhouse, came in and attacked the northern tribes, and wiped them out. Basically, it was like, wow. Yeah. Now, some of the commentaries I looked at said that Isaiah came from the northern regions, spent time in the northern regions, but when this happened, then he must have slipped down into Jerusalem, into the south. And then we find him kind of being in the courts and with the kings and at various times.
Well, and Isaiah 1:1 lists 4 different kings of the south, of Judah.
Yeah, that he was under.
That he was, or his ministry. Yeah, basically, right?
Right. Right. So all that happens during Isaiah's lifetime. You know, you got all this stuff going on. But the book itself spans longer than that. So the first 39 chapters, easy way to say it, happens during his lifetime. But then later on, Babylon starts coming into power.
Yep.
So Assyria, you know, is a powerhouse in the region. Babylon's trying to get it figured out, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And we find in 605 BC, Babylon with Nebuchadnezzar attacks Israel, and that would have been the southern kingdom.
Yeah, Judah, right?
Yeah, Judah, right? Because that was really all that was left.
But based on those numbers, that's 100 years
right after that,
after Isaiah's time.
Right. So we see prophecies, right? Right of Isaiah of Isaiah saying, "Hey guys, you got to change, or this is going to happen."
Yep.
And everybody's saying, "Yeah," and then forgetting about it.
And then it happened.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we think about it in those terms from the standpoint of chapters 1 through 39 are Isaiah's time. It's pre what they call the exile. So Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and he's basically Babylon was beginning to be that powerhouse, and in fact he was over in Egypt, and he won a major victory over there.
Yeah.
He was coming back through. He's going to be going home to Babylon. His father died. He's going to be crowned king. And he makes a stop in Israel, and he finds a lot of treasures there. Steals everything, including people.
Yeah, some.
Right,
Yeah.
and that's where Daniel comes from.
It's very interesting that he stopped outside of Judah and Jerusalem, and like 3 different ways he prayed to his gods. Should I? Shouldn't I? Should I? Shouldn't I? Right?
Yeah.
Should I just go back home? Should I, have a snack here in Judah on the way back home, basically? And his gods, right? His gods said,
"Go ahead,
do it," right?
Yeah.
And so some of the things from the temple, not the whole thing, some of the things from the temple, Daniel, and that's where Daniel's story starts.
Right. And it's interesting. Some of the things that Nebuchadnezzar takes actually get returned.
Yes, they do. It's so cool.
It is like way cool.
Yep.
Way cool.
Yep.
So
almost 100 years later, or actually even more than 100 years later. Actually,
yeah. For the first, is that the first restoration? Is that,
Yeah, 70 years for the first restoration, but then the captivities happened in 3 sets, and the restorations actually happened in 3 sets as well, under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah.
Right.
So,
right. Last thing I want to talk about is chapter 39. I know we're starting reading in 40, but if you go back just one chapter, it's really not that long, and I found it very interesting. We have a king, Hezekiah. Hezekiah.
Mm-hmm.
He is trying to get on Babylon's good side. So you kind of see the power struggle there, where Assyria's putting a lot of pressure on Judah, and Judah's looking for the help. The bullies coming out. So the nerd is trying to find somebody else to get on his side. So he had been sick. The king of Babylon's son comes, and he basically opens the storeroom and shows them all the wealth that they have. Yeah. Which doesn't seem to be the right thing to do.
Nope.
But he does anyways. And in 39:6, Isaiah says, "Look, a time is coming when everything in your palace and the things your ancestors have accumulated to this day will be carried away to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord." I mean, how... Some prophecies you don't quite understand. That's pretty specific there.
Yeah.
And Hezekiah at the end basically says something along the lines of, "I don't really care as long as we have peace during my lifetime."
Yeah. That's the type of leadership that you want.
Yeah, right. Right. So that's 39, and then you'll get into 40, which like we were talking about, is completely different.
Yeah.
So there's a break there.
Yeah.
So what's going on?
Yeah, well, and of course, the rest of the first 39 chapters, there's a lot of the famous stuff that, unto you a child is born, and, Christmas stuff, a lot of, the virgin birth and all that.
The throne room.
The throne room.
I was going to throw that in.
The throne room in chapter 6.
That is awesome. Right.
So we're not saying that chapters 1 through 39 are not worth reading. Right. We're not saying, it's all just history, it's not worth reading. There's a ton of stuff in there. But but 40 through 66 really shifts direction in a big way.
Right.
Because in the first 39 chapters, it's all basically doomsday type stuff, right?
Right. Come back.
Come back to
don't
me,
do this,
or you're gonna get crushed. Right. And even here, like you just read, you know, this stuff that you've accumulated will be taken away. Your descendants will be taken away. He's like, you know, whatever.
Yeah. Well, almost like, at the beginning, don't go down that path. Don't go down that path. Now you're so far down that path.
There's almost no point of return, right? Yeah. And I think that's where it is. And so if this were a movie, or like an old movie, right here would be intermission.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, we'd be taking our break, we'd be going to the snack bar, you know, using the restroom, and then coming back to see, okay, we've got the history, we've got the setup, we've got the foretelling, all of this destruction is going to happen. What could be left?
Right.
Well, chapter 40 opens with these words. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak kindly to Jerusalem. Nothing at all like...
Yeah, total shift. So you're kind of aware something happened.
Yeah.
Right.
So in between chapter 39 and chapter 40, there is an almost 3,000 year gap. Okay, there's about a 2,600 year gap between 2,700 year gap between Assyria and before Babylon hits. And what this is talking about is we're shooting all the way into the future, into the millennial kingdom, where for chapters 40 through 66, it really sort of breaks down into three parts. Okay. And those three parts we see in verse 2. Here's the message. Speak kindly to Jerusalem and tell her three things. Now, the net is going to change the wording here a little bit. I'm not really sure I like that. I like some other translations better, because in the Hebrew there's the same word, that. It sets it up in parallel. And the net
so you can tell.
The net sort of shifts that and makes the last one sort of explanatory, which I don't think it's supposed to be. But here's the message, and here's what 40 through 66 tell us. That, number one, the time of her warfare is over. Well, obviously that's not true, because that ain't really started yet when Isaiah said this. But there will be a time that the time of Israel's warfare, it shall no longer be at war. And that really taps back into the Davidic covenant. God told David, there will be a time where you will live in this land, you will never be attacked again, Israel will be safe and in peace forever. Right? Well, it hasn't happened yet. If anybody pays attention to the Middle East, right? It hasn't happened yet. But here it says the time of your warfare is over. So in 40 through about 48, chapters 40 through 48, it's going to talk about sort of that general theme. Number two, that that her punishment is completed. Well, again, hasn't been the case yet. I love the fact, though, that it's written in the past tense. In the Hebrew, in the perfect tense, where God considers this a done deal, even though here we are 2,700 years and it hasn't happened yet. I mentioned to you this past weekend that prophecy, and I didn't make this up, people have said this for a long time, but prophecy is just history written in advance.
Yeah, which is pretty awesome.
That's a really cool way to look at it. Prophecy is just history written in advance. You can't change history. And when God says, this I will do, you can't change that either. You just have to wait.
It's just a question of how.
How and when. How and when. So chapters 49 through about 55, 6, 7, right in there, sort of deal with this broader theme about their punishment being over, right? Number 3, the Lord has made her pay double for all her sins. Other translations say the Lord has paid back to them, because it's sort of a repayment type thing, has paid back to them double. So the net takes this as referring specifically as punishment for sins. Some commentators and translations look at it as actually blessing coming out of the punishment. So depending on, you can look at it both ways. If you look at it the second way, the blessing coming out of punishment, then these last 8 chapters or so, about 58, 59 through 66, that's where we really get into descriptions of the kingdom, the new heavens and the new earth. A lot of that stuff is going to be in the end there. Chapter 61, I can't wait to get to chapter 61 in our videos, because this is really cool when it comes to oak tree. Chapter 63 talks about the part of the battle or the war campaign of Armageddon. 64, 65, 66 talk about the new heavens and the new earth. I mean, we're talking way into the future now.
Right.
Yeah.
So are any of these talking about Babylon?
Most of them are not going to talk about Babylon.
Okay, because that would have been in 1 through 39.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there is still some stuff in there, but it's really cool that a lot of it's really focused more on the future. Yeah, the way future, even for us, future, right? So then verse 3 is a verse that most of the people will recognize. A voice cries out, "In the wilderness, clear the way for the Lord."
Yeah, John
the Baptizer, right? The gospel writers come back to chapter 40, verse 3 and say, "Hey, Messiah came," right? And he was the voice that was saying, "Prepare the way." Chapter 61, Jesus reads when he goes to the synagogue in Nazareth, and it reads the first verse and a half or so, and closes the scroll and says, "Today this has been fulfilled in your ears." So we're seeing some of that near far, although it's not as near to Isaiah, but we're seeing both first and second comings. But mostly, a lot of the stuff will be second coming, right? So, a couple of thoughts that are sort of related to the whole reading, not just this.
Just 40.
Yeah, so we'll be in 40 and the first half of 41 this week, and these first couple of chapters spend a lot of time. God spends a lot of time saying, "You can trust me, and here's how. Here's how you can know you can trust me." And it's just it's almost like a theology of God and His power. And so I just jotted down a couple of notes to encourage us over the next 6 weeks, especially if you haven't spent a lot of time in Isaiah. We're going to skip around more in these first few chapters than in the later ones, because so much of it is related directly to Israel. Okay, so we'll cut out some chunks that are like, okay, that's Israel. So our focus will be more in these first several chapters. Our focus will be more on God and His character, as He says, "I am the one that you can trust to fulfill these promises that I made, these prophecies."
Right. Well, I even love that in 40, where you're seeing some of that.
Yeah.
Who's doing that? Who's going to be there at the end? Who was there at the beginning?
Yeah. Some really cool stuff. Starting with chapter 48, we will read almost every chapter in its entirety, except for a couple. There are a couple we'll skip. From 48 to 66, there were a couple chapters we'll skip. But most of them from that point on, we'll read the whole thing, not just sections out of them. A lot of them are short, so maybe only 15 to 20 verses for the entire chapter. So we'll be able to do a chapter a day in a handful of verses. They're pretty quick reads, and we'll be able to cover multiple chapters.
That's how we get through it
in
pretty
a week.
Quick.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. Because we're talking about 27 chapters here in 6 weeks, but we're taking out some chunks and we're reading them pretty quickly. So this will be a great time to practice your Bible study and Bible interpretation skills.
So why would that be?
Why would that be? As you read, and just reading my notes that I put here, as you read, be careful to consider the passages in their context, right? 4 things. Number 1, if it's a promise for Israel, don't try to claim it for yourself.
Guilty. Well, it's easy to do, right? Because it's all about me. Yeah. And when you're reading it, you want it to be about you.
Well, there's a very famous phrase coming up, and honestly, now I don't remember if we're reading that section. Maybe we'll be skipping it. But there's that phrase coming up that says, "No weapon that's fashioned or formed against you will be able to stand." Well, you hear that all the time, people
Yeah.
quoting and claiming that it's to Israel in a very specific context. So we've got to be careful with that. So that's number one. Number two, if it's a general call, like chapter 55 is a general call, come all who seek the Lord while he may be found, come all who are thirsty. It's for everybody, not just Israel. See how you're responding to that. How do you respond to general calls? You know, when they're in the passage. Number three, if it's a timeless truth, like we'll see in these first several chapters with God's character, let that grow your theology in that area, right? Let those things sink in and build your theology, for instance, of God and who he is and his character.
Right. So exactly what you're saying. You know, without the Bible, we don't know a whole lot about God.
Right.
You know, maybe we have this hole we're trying to fill, but we get to see some character.
Yeah.
We get to see what he's doing, and we know what he's doing, but we see it at a different level.
Yeah.
And it kind of makes you stop and think, wow.
Well, especially this is for the most part, this isn't narrative. It's not history or story or whatever. It's prophecy, and a lot of this is dictation. This is God actually speaking for himself. I am the person who did this. So you've got a little bit of play back and forth between Isaiah and God, but there's a lot of God saying and mocking the false gods. I love those sections.
Yeah. Yep. I think there's one this week.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. So, and then number four, there will likely be several verses or passages that you've heard before, that you know, but that you may not have remembered were from Isaiah. You're like, I couldn't have told you that was in Isaiah, right?
Well, like you said, a lot of times Isaiah shows up in the New Testament.
Yeah.
You know, and it's quoted, so you're like, oh, that was in Matthew. Well, yeah, it was, but but it goes back.
Right. So let those things, when you come across them, just keep building that cross-reference index, that cross-reference database in your brain, right? It's like,
storage full.
Yeah, right. But a lot of times people tell me, oh, I just can't remember, where it's located. Like, you don't have to remember everything where it's located.
Right.
If you can get the book and chapter,
yeah, you can find it.
You can find it. Most chapters
and
aren't that
can,
long. And
of
course, you can search it in Bible software and everything. But that still
takes time.
I'm still of the opinion that knowing where I'm old school. If you can find it, if you know where it is, it's a whole lot easier to use it.
It definitely is.
And the Holy Spirit can use it while you're talking to somebody.
Right.
So grow your theology, but then also grow your general awareness of where things are located in the Bible. Right? So those are my thoughts. Those are my encouragements as we go into these next 6 weeks of reading in Isaiah. Okay. Now, many of you know that I have a book on the chapter summaries in the New Testament, right? I've summarized every chapter in the New Testament. I've written the one for the Old Testament. It's not published yet, but wait.
So maybe I got an advance copy.
If you look in the description, the link for my summaries for chapters 40 through 66, the introduction to Isaiah and chapters 40 through 66 are there. You can download the PDF, and so you can use that. It'll be obviously part of the upcoming book, but you can use that.
Yeah. So again, it's nice to be able to download that, put it on your own device, keep it, and then as we move from chapter to chapter, read what you have to say. So read the first part, which is the intro, and then as we do chapters, it's really not that much more reading, but sometimes it's just oh, that's what they're talking about.
Yeah,
it helps orient you.
Yeah, and people do it differently. You want to read the summary first, and like you watch the video and then read the summary,
right,
and then actually read the text. Or you watch the video and then you read during the week and then you just read the summary at the end of the week, just as a recap type thing. However it works, however it works for you. But I want you to be able to have that. So, okay,
yeah.
Is that? I think that wraps it up. For
I think
week,
so.
Probably.
I think so. I think as we do this, next week and the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to get into some of the chapters more. Yeah. But we definitely want to be able to bring in more outside influences than we did in Luke, because there are,
Right.
to help set up what he's talking about,
Yeah.
and what's going on.
And there will always be, specific verses or specific things to point out, just sort of cool things that I don't want you to miss, or that you see in there and you don't want us to miss. And
right.
so that'll be good. But figured that seeing a bigger picture this time would be really helpful as we get started. So, as always, we encourage you to share your comments, ask your questions, share your insights as you read and as you work through it. Share the link with your friends. Put it on your social media. Invite people to watch it with you or read together with you. Families or friends or whatever. And then you can use that as a discussion point. You can start a group. You can have a discussion just on social media, one-on-one with people at work or neighbors or whatever. And as you talk about our church, as you talk about your faith and what you're learning and everything, hopefully this is a good tool that will help you do that. So,
Yeah. Right.
Okay?
Good. Yep.
All right. Well, then enjoy Isaiah 40 and 41. And we'll see you next week with a little bit more.
See you.
Bye.